I've spent most of my adult life moving quietly through my family's chaos like a shadow. I pay the bills, fix the leaky faucets, schedule the repairs, handle doctor appointments, manage groceries, and even cover the occasional emergency my parents or my brother refuse to plan for. Nobody asks if I need a break. Nobody notices when I silently absorb their disappointments or inconveniences. I've never asked for credit, and I've rarely gotten thanks. My brother, Daniel, 22, has never once lifted a finger to contribute. He gets praised for the smallest things. He can string a sentence together impressively in an interview. He brings home an A on a test. He can cook one meal without burning it, and suddenly he's a golden child. That's the word my mother whispered once to a friend in my presence, though I'd been told I'd overcomplicate things if I spoke up. I can't count how many mornings I wake to find the kitchen a mess, dishes piled high, wrappers and coffee cups scattered, and Daniel asleep upstairs, headphones in, as if the world owes him tidiness. I clean it quietly, sometimes muttering under my breath about how I don't mind, but the truth is I mind. Every small task I take on, every invisible effort chips away at me. I've noticed the way my parents' eyes skim past me, landing on him for approval, even when I've solved problems no one else could. Last week, my father left the car in the shop for 3 days. I arranged a rental, handled insurance, and drove him to work, not a single word of acknowledgement. The next day, Daniel needed a bus pass for a field trip. My mother handed him the envelope with cash and a smile. I helped pay the deductible out of my own account. I remember one Sunday afternoon when we were supposed to celebrate my father's birthday. I spent hours preparing the meal, ironing tablecloths and setting candles, but Daniel, starving and exhausted, wandered in late from a video game marathon. My father fussed over him, praising his gaming discipline and the creative sketch he'd made online. I set down the dishes and sat quietly in the corner, scraping the crumbs from my plate while listening to my family coo over his efforts. I could feel a hollow ache twist in my chest. At 28, I was still treated like the background, the utility, the unpaid labor that made everyone else's life smoother. The subtle disrespect is what hurts the most. Invitations forgotten, my opinions dismissed with a casual, "You don't need to worry about that." My contributions ignored, and yet I am expected to handle every fallout. Emotional manipulation is a constant. My mother will sigh heavily, glance at me with fake despair, and say, "I just can't do everything myself," when all she's done is misplace a bill or burn toast. I'll solve the problem while she watches, smiling faintly as if that's proof she's being supported, not that she's exploiting me. Daniel leans into this habit effortlessly. If he wants a day off, an extension, an extra favor, he pouts or raises his eyebrows, and suddenly the world bends around him. I bend silently, until my patience wears thin. It wasn't until last month that I felt the first real tremor of clarity. My father asked me to co-sign for Daniel's new car loan. I paused, carefully considering my own savings, the risk, and the way my account had been quietly drained over the years to cover everything from utilities to medical bills. I asked for a copy of the loan contract. My father brushed it off. "He's your brother," he said. "You'll want to help him." That word, want, felt like a trap. My stomach knotted as I realized how often want had been used to disguise obligation, how my willingness had been manipulated into duty. Daniel doesn't see the sacrifices, the steady support. He only sees what he can take. I began to observe myself differently after that day. The quiet tension that had lived in my shoulders for years became a scream in my mind. I noticed how I flinched when my mother redirected tasks at me without asking. I noticed how Daniel's entitlement crept into conversations, how he assumed things would always be handed to him. I remembered all the weekends I canceled plans because someone needed me, all the extra shifts I took so I could cover a family expense without complaint, all the small humiliations that had been normalized. I realized I wasn't just overworked, I was being quietly erased. The turning point was subtle, almost unremarkable. My mother asked me to buy groceries one evening while she and Daniel ran an errand that ended up being a 3-hour coffee and shopping spree. I came home to find my carefully organized pantry rearranged to accommodate Daniel's favorite snacks. There was no note, no acknowledgement that I had been the one who bought everything. I felt a sharp, unexplainable pang of betrayal. I had fed them, cleaned for them, banked for them, and this was the thanks I received. Silent disregard and the assumption that I would continue. That night, I lay awake thinking about how long I had tolerated this, how I had always been expected to vanish behind their convenience and comfort. I realized then that if I stayed, I would continue to disappear. I began to plan quietly. No dramatic confrontations, no ultimatums. I watched my finances closely, started packing essentials one by one into boxes I stored in my car, and picked an apartment within walking distance from work. I didn't announce my intentions. I simply began building the means to leave. There was a certain clarity in the silence, a satisfaction in knowing I was reclaiming agency. I kept my routines, my quiet efficiency, but I no longer allowed myself to be used without thought. I stopped volunteering for extra errands unless they fell within reason. I stopped giving money without documentation. My parents noticed, of course, but they interpreted it as fatigue or busyness. I smiled quietly to myself. They had no idea what was coming. The day I moved out was ordinary, unremarkable, almost invisible. I waited until my parents were at a church event and Daniel was at a friend's house. I loaded my car with essentials, locked the door, and left. I left no notes, no dramatic letters. I left quietly, like the ghost they had always expected me to be. Driving away, I felt a strange combination of fear, relief, and anticipation. For the first time in years, I was making a choice entirely for myself. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. My mother called 3 times that evening, then texted asking where I was. My father suddenly realized the bills weren't paid on time because I hadn't handled them this month. Daniel's laptop needed updates, his car needed fuel, and no one had thought to check. The panic was subtle at first, frantic reminders, missed deadlines, whispered arguments behind closed doors, but it grew as the days passed. I watched from my apartment window as they struggled to function without me. And it felt neither cruel nor vindictive. It was simply the natural consequence of years of dependence on the person they had ignored. Over the weeks, I began to settle into my own rhythm. I learned that my presence wasn't required to validate life. I could cook what I wanted, spend my money on myself, and set boundaries without guilt. The relief was intoxicating. Emails to work, calls to friends, trips to local cafes. I felt like I was finally breathing in a life that wasn't prearranged by others. I realized I had been carrying an entire household on my back while pretending it didn't weigh me down. That weight was gone. Months later, my parents attempted to mend the gaps I had left. Apologies were whispered, awkward attempts at conversation made. Daniel asked for my advice, hesitated, and then shrugged, returning to his routine. I listened politely, offered guidance where I wanted to, but my life had changed. I no longer exist to support their comfort. I had built my own comfort, and I finally understood the value of my own labor, my own time, and my own self-respect. I am no longer invisible. I am no longer a utility. I am a person with priorities, needs, and dreams that exist independent of their approval. I am free. The first week in my apartment felt surreal. Every room, every shelf, every drawer was exactly where I wanted it. I didn't have to ask permission to hang a picture, play music, or leave the kitchen messy for a moment. The freedom was dizzying. Yet even in that liberation, there was a quiet ache, the lingering residue of years spent invisible. I caught myself imagining their reactions, a habit I realized I was still tethered to. But slowly, I let those thoughts fade, focusing instead on how I moved, cooked, and rested without interruption. I could see clearly for the first time how exhausting it had been to constantly anticipate needs no one else would notice. My parents' calls increased after the first few days. At first, they were casual, a check-in here or there. But soon, the tone shifted. My father's voice, usually so authoritative, carried an edge of panic. "Lauren, the water heater broke. Can you—" I had already learned to silence my reflex to drop everything. I calmly explained, "I'm not there anymore. You'll need to call a plumber or arrange for a repair." My mother's response was measured but laced with tension. We thought you'd still handle things. You've always handled things." Daniel called too, asking questions I used to answer without hesitation. His tone was confused, anxious, almost pleading. Can you, help me figure out the car registration?" I said. "I'm not co-signing anything anymore. You'll need to handle it on your own." There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath, and then a mumbled, "Okay." I hung up, feeling a mixture of guilt and relief. It was strange to hear them floundering without me. I realized how much I had carried, silently, for years. The house was a quiet battlefield I had navigated alone, and now, without me, the cracks were showing. At first, I felt a twinge of doubt. Had I been too harsh? Too calculated? Then I remembered every time I had been dismissed, every subtle jab disguised as humor, every favor extracted under the guise of family obligation. I remembered my brother, lounging on the couch while I rearranged the entire kitchen to accommodate his whims. I remembered my mother's sighs of, "I can't do everything myself," spoken while I folded laundry I hadn't been asked to do. I realized that leaving was the only way I could reclaim myself. My parents began to scramble visibly. Bills went unpaid for a week before they remembered to call a service. Daniel's attempts to cook ended in minor disasters. A fridge full of leftovers went bad because no one checked the expiration dates. No one thought to organize or clean. I heard about it through mutual friends and text messages from Daniel, apologetic yet still hesitant to truly take responsibility. It was gratifying in a quiet, almost guilty way. Not revenge, not satisfaction over their panic, but clarity. They had relied on me too heavily, and now they were learning, slowly, the cost of that dependence. At work, I felt lighter than I had in years. I spent evenings reading, journaling, even binge-watching shows I had avoided because I needed to be home for everyone. I started cooking for myself, experimenting with meals I enjoyed without worrying about whether someone else would complain. I began walking around my neighborhood, taking in the city as if it were mine to explore for the first time. There was a rhythm, a freedom, a profound sense of possibility. I realized the years I had spent invisible weren't wasted. They had taught me resilience, patience, and meticulous care, but I no longer had to expend them solely for others. Months passed. My parents' panic had transformed into guilt. My mother called once to apologize for not appreciating everything I did, though the words were tentative, almost embarrassed. My father tried to understand why I had left without a word, and Daniel, in his own way, started learning self-reliance. I answered selectively, no longer dropping everything at the first request. When I did help, it was with conditions and boundaries clearly defined. It was strange, even a little uncomfortable for them to meet my limits. Yet, for the first time, I felt respected. Not because they had changed entirely, but because I had changed. I no longer allowed exploitation to continue. The subtle betrayals and manipulations I had endured had left marks, but they also taught me to read people clearly, to anticipate behavior without being controlled by it. I noticed how my boundaries shifted the family dynamic almost immediately. My absence forced them to confront the consequences of their neglect. The unspoken truth they had ignored for so long was finally unavoidable. I had been the engine, the invisible labor, the steadying hand, and without me, the house faltered. They couldn't pretend any longer. I started spending weekends with friends, building a life outside the household I had always supported. I joined a local co-op, volunteered once a month, and started saving for a small solo trip I had dreamed of for years. Each step was deliberate, intentional, and fully mine. I realized how little time I had spent doing anything purely for myself. The feeling of agency, of being the primary architect of my own life, was intoxicating. The final turning point came unexpectedly. My mother invited me back for a family dinner, a casual request that felt loaded with unspoken acknowledgement. I agreed, cautiously. As I walked in, I noticed the small adjustments they had made in my absence. The pantry rearranged sensibly, the dishes done without being prompted, the bills organized, Daniel actively participating in conversation instead of monopolizing attention. It was strange, almost surreal, but not rewarding in a traditional sense. I saw the results of necessity forcing growth, not affection inspiring change. We ate dinner together. I listened more than I spoke, offering advice only when asked. There were no apologies, no dramatic declarations of guilt, only subtle recognition that my role had been indispensable. I felt neither superiority nor satisfaction. I felt clarity. I understood that their struggle without me was the natural outcome of neglect and imbalance, and my presence in my own life had created an equilibrium I had never known. Walking home that night, I realized I had grown in ways the family could never fully acknowledge. I was free from the invisible chains of constant labor and subtle disrespect. I no longer measured my worth against their appreciation or approval. I had created a life defined by intention, not obligation, by choice, not expectation. The relief was complete, a deep, resonant freedom that had been years in the making. I understood finally that love and family are not about constant sacrifice at the expense of self. They are about mutual respect, acknowledgement, and balance. I had given far more than my share, silently, for too long, but leaving was not cruelty. It was preservation. And in that preservation, I found something I had never truly known before: peace, clarity, and the unwavering knowledge that I am enough, on my own, fully visible, fully alive. I am no longer a shadow. I am no longer the invisible caretaker of a family too blind to see me. I am myself, entirely, without apology, and it is the most profound gift I have ever given me. Even after months away, I occasionally caught myself imagining what it would have been like to speak up sooner, to draw boundaries earlier. The thought made me ache briefly, but then clarity returned. There was no shame in leaving. There was only wisdom in recognizing my own worth. I began journaling, recording small victories I had overlooked for years. Mornings spent sipping coffee without interruption, evenings spent walking in silence, a fridge stocked entirely with foods I actually liked, bills managed on my own terms. I realized that freedom wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, profound, and slowly reshaping the contours of my life. My parents began to adjust in small, awkward ways. My father called occasionally to ask a question he could have solved himself, and I answered patiently but firmly. "You'll need to figure this out, Dad. I can guide you, but I'm not there every day." My mother started paying more attention to her own responsibilities, though I still noticed her habitual sighs when something didn't go perfectly. Daniel, surprisingly, began to develop a kind of self-reliance. His gaming console was cleaned, bills were paid on time, and he started cooking simple meals without anyone hovering. I didn't gloat. I observed quietly, content that they were learning the lessons I had long ago mastered, though through necessity rather than choice. There were moments of nostalgia, brief pangs of guilt, and fleeting longing. I remembered family dinners, laughter, shared movies, and quiet Sunday mornings. But those memories were no longer tainted by exploitation. They were recollections, not obligations. I began hosting small dinners with friends, experimenting with recipes I had always wanted to try, setting the table exactly how I liked. No one critiqued my choices. No one assumed I would clean up after them. I felt grounded, alive in a way I hadn't known was possible. One afternoon, Daniel called me, his voice hesitant. "Lauren, can you help me with the car insurance?" Normally, I would have rushed to fix it, absorbed the stress silently, and moved on without recognition. This time, I paused. "I can guide you through it step by step, but you have to do it yourself," I said. The silence on the line was telling. I could hear him processing the reality I had set. I wasn't there to rescue him automatically. Finally, he muttered, "Okay, thanks, I guess," and hung up. The relief I felt was not about denying him help, but about reinforcing the boundaries I had struggled to assert for years. I had learned to separate care from sacrifice, support from exploitation. I started setting long-term goals that had nothing to do with my family. I signed up for an online course I had postponed for years. I planned a short solo trip, imagining myself in a place where no one knew my history, my responsibilities, my invisible labor. I dreamed of mornings with nothing on the schedule but my own desires. For the first time, I felt the thrill of making plans solely for my own growth. There was no guilt, no whispered accusations from my conscience, only a growing sense of autonomy. Even the small rituals I had long taken for granted became meaningful. Doing laundry on my own schedule, rearranging my living space to suit my mood, cooking recipes I enjoyed without negotiation. All of these acts were quiet celebrations of self-possession. I realized that my years of labor had prepared me for this, even if they had also chained me. I had become competent, resilient, and patient beyond my years, and now those qualities served me entirely, without extraction from others. Occasionally, my parents invited me back, subtly, to help Daniel with homework or to give advice about managing the household. I agreed only when it felt reasonable and on my terms, often for a few hours and no more. I could see the surprise in their faces when I refused tasks I would have previously taken on instinctively. It was not about punishing them. It was about reinforcing the life I had finally built.